While the First Step Act was indeed a groundbreaking piece of legislation at the federal level, as we've heard, there's still much work to be done to reform our prison system at the state and local levels, which happen to hold the vast majority of the more than 2 million people in jails and prisons across the country. I am honored to welcome to the stage our panel to explore next steps, rehabilitation programs, and initiatives that can help reduce relapses. Please welcome on stage Nicole Porter, Director of Advocacy with the Sentencing Project. Nicole manages the Sentencing Project's state and local advocacy efforts on sentencing reform, voting rights, and eliminating racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And Topeka Sam, founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries. Topeka's story is one of inspiration and indeed hope. After her release from prison in 2015, Topeka founded the Ladies of Hope Ministries, whose mission is to help disenfranchised and marginalized women transition back into society. Topeka led the charge to raise awareness about Alice Marie Johnson, who was granted clemency by President Trump last year. Joining Nicole and Topeka on stage is Hill TV's host, Jamal Simmons. Jamal?
Thank you, Jack. Can we give it up for my boss, Jack? You know, we gotta pay the bills around here. I gotta keep a job. Hi, everybody. Yes. So we got some serious business to talk about here today. I know you guys have been really immersed in this and having a conversation before we came out here. But I'm being joined really by these two guests who know so much more about this than I do, and so I want to give them a chance to talk. I also want to give you a chance to ask them questions. So please start to think through what the questions are you would like to ask these women. And we're going to have, what do we have, microphones that will come through the audience? Yes, we'll have microphones at the time when we're ready for that. But I want to ask you guys as we get started, one really simple question that's been burning for me, which is, should we incarcerate people for nonviolent offenses?
I mean, I think one of the opportunities for where the conversation is now, given all of this bipartisan enthusiasm, is that it should create space to change the presumption around arrest and incarceration overall, and that hopefully will change our status quo expectations around incarcerating people for nonviolent offenses. People are incarcerated for probation and parole violations, which means that, and I know Topeka's work in many ways is focused on this, that, you know, if you're on parole or probation and you violate, you can't meet with your supervision officer, or you show up late to a meeting, you can be reincarcerated for that. And nationally, 20% of prison admissions each year have historically been for technical violations on supervision. So the opportunities with where the conversation are today is that it can change presumptions around all of that.
Yeah, and I would just add that we cannot continue to separate things between violence and nonviolent. I think that it's incredibly important for us to begin to look at each circumstance and find out what's really happening with the individual that's actually in front of the judge and the prosecutor going through the system. And, you know, there are alternatives to incarceration, even as it relates to a violent offense. For example, women who have what's considered or categorized as a violent crime, typically it is some type of abuser, you know, retaliation. Mm-hmm. And so to send a woman to prison for life, you know, or even more for something where a lot of times she's cried out, she's asked for help, there has been documentation to show that, and then, you know, there is a circumstance that happens where she has to protect herself or her family. We don't need to be incarcerating people for life under that. So I think, as you know, Nicole said, this is an exciting time because we can look at, you know, everyone can look at what is happening in the criminal legal system and really try to move and make some change.
What are some of the alternatives to incarceration that you've seen that are worth exploring more and that we should be spending more time going through?
Well, I think, you know, because this is about next steps, that the alternatives we should be looking at should be intentional efforts to reduce people bound for prison. And I think that there are great lessons from the states, and I know that some of your earlier guests this morning talked about the states being laboratories, and that the First Step Act that passed in Congress was in many ways inspired by state reforms. So at the local level, there are intentional efforts to divert prison-bound defendants whose first offense may be for a robbery offense, so not categorized as a nonviolent drug or property offense. And there are other efforts to expand community-based treatment to make those solutions more acceptable and trustworthy to judicial practitioners and other practitioners who have the discretion to direct those prison-bound defendants into local programs rather into state prison facilities.
I know restorative justice is one of the topics that comes up a lot, that perhaps there's a way for offenders to, who don't go to keep them from going to prison, but to be doing things that actually, I don't know, will rehabilitate them and maybe interact with the people that they have offended and try to build some restoration through that process. Are you familiar with that, or you pay attention to that?
I am. I don't know if Topeka has something she wants to
Yeah,
add
I could weigh in a little bit on that. That, you know, when we think about restorative justice, it's not just about restoring the person or the harmed party, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because both parties are harmed. Typically, a person leading into some type of act of violence or trauma has been inflicted upon them. So I think what Nicole had said a little earlier about, you know, putting resources back into the community, giving people opportunities, listening to children, if we think about our youth, because a lot of times there is some history that shows that a person has, you know, it's been kind of leading up to a certain circumstance in their life, and if we begin to start from our kids, we move up into the communities, giving back resources within these communities that are already marginalized and disenfranchised. I believe that the restorative process starts there.
Can I just add one thing? So I think that part of the opportunity for where we are now is investing in community-based treatment that allows for restorative justice. And that treatment isn't just for drug offenses, but also for serious property offenses like robbery. And many of the first-time defendants who may be charged with the robbery offense would benefit from a restorative justice program where they learn how their robbery, how their serious property offense may have resulted in harm done to a victim. And there are programs like that happening in local communities all around the country. In fact, right here in DC, there are intentional efforts to divert prison-bound first-time defendants into these community programs where they interact with the victims and learn about the restorative principles that can hopefully prevent their future interaction with law enforcement altogether.
Topeka, you had some interesting work. You work with women in particular, right? Can you tell us about the special challenges that women face in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, sure. So part of my work around the legislative advocacy is with Cut 50 on dignity for incarcerated women. And so when we think about women who are incarcerated and the fact that women are still getting shackled in this country during child labor, you know, women are not getting proper hygiene products and things that they need. Families are continuing to be ripped apart, and women are being put thousands of miles away from their children, you know. And so when I started working with Cut 50 on dignity, it had started as legislation through the National Council from women who were formerly incarcerated and incarcerated women who helped to draft this legislation. And then what we did was we took the legislation state by state and let other women who are formerly incarcerated to lead that legislation. Because though we want to decarcerate and we want to end incarceration for women and girls, we also understand the conditions of confinement and that they need to be more humane. So that's part of the work on the legislative space, and we've passed 8 pieces of legislation last year in 8 states around dignity, and this year we're looking to pass 8 more pieces of legislation. The goal is 20 pieces by 2020. And then on my organization, Ladies of Hope Ministries, we focus specifically on giving women access and resources to opportunity through high-quality education, spiritual empowerment, housing, and advocacy. We also believe that, you know, how can I advocate for myself or be empowered if I don't have a safe place to live or food to eat? And so we provide everyone those things at the basic level so you don't have to worry. And then we make sure we start partnering with different organizations, different corporations to place people so they can begin to see themselves where they can actually thrive to be. So it's exciting. Right now we're expanding to 5 different cities this year, doing Hope House and in Trinidad and Tobago. We're getting a lot of support nationally and globally for the work because women are not getting focused on, you know, and when you impact a woman, you're impacting the children, you're impacting the community.
Yeah, I was I actually have a friend who's going through this right now through a criminal process. And one of the women who came and testified on her behalf was a psychiatrist who was making the case that it wasn't just what happens to this woman, but her children, who would then be impacted by having, and it was not a violent crime, I think it was some sort of a theft or, but they would have to wrestle with having their mom in jail and what that would mean for the children's lives going forward if they actually put her in prison for some period of time.
No, it happens all the time, Nicole. I know you can talk a little bit more about that also, but children are the most affected. And they're harmed, right? Because then they're left sometimes having to go through foster system, which is another prison in and of itself. And then you have them either not being able to see their parents because then again, they're thousands of miles away. And, Nicole, I want you to chime in because I don't want to take up all the time.
Come on, Nicole. She's passing the ball.
And I think changing that view opens up an opportunity for questioning what is prison for to begin with. And can challenge lawmakers and advocates and the people looking at mass incarceration and what solutions to manage down the nation's incarceration rate by offering alternatives to incarceration or relief for people sentenced to prison who may have dependents, who may have left children behind. The neighborhood I grew up in North Houston, when I got to my teens and early 20s, just about every young man that I grew up with had been in prison or jail at some point. And it was almost sort of a normal experience for my community.
Did we grow up in the same neighborhood?
Well, we talked earlier about, different neighborhoods around the country, a lot of similarities, a lot of overlap, just might be, the zip code might be different. And because mass incarceration is such a normative experience in this country, really changing the way we view it overall has got to be what happens if we want to return the country to a point where incarceration isn't an expectation for some neighborhoods around the nation.
Absolutely. So, all right, I'd love to get the audience involved if you guys got any questions. I see one over here, this woman with her hand up. Great.
Hi, I just want to thank you guys so much for having this specific panel. Thank you to the Hill for having this panel. Thank you to American University. If you guys get a chance, please check out they're having an exhibit. It's called Justice Through a New Lens. And it's about juvenile justice system and how they incarcerate our youth.
Can you tell us your name and
yes.
where you're from? Yeah, stand
My
up so we can see you. There you go.
My name is Tori Marshall Wallace. I'm born and raised in Washington, D.C. I'm with Equity First Alliance and Cage Free Repair. My question is, legislating and lobbying on a federal level. I want to know, what does that conversation look like? Because a lot of what it sounds like is restorative justice as well as reparative justice with the criminal justice reform system. So it looks like a 360. When you talk about it, do you touch on generational PTSD and trauma and what it looks like? Because I heard how both of you agreed that, we all exist in different states and different cities due to Reaganomics, due to Hoover, due to 1787 Constitution, where we're 3/5 of a person. What does that conversation look like when you're lobbying and you're creating legislation? How do we take that back to our community for community reinvestment when we're trying to educate the demographic?
And let's broaden it for this panel, federal as well as the state level when you're trying to advocate for these changes.
Well, I think those conversations have to happen in the offices, whether or not it's in D.C. or in the state capital in my home state of Texas in Austin or Albany in New York and every capital around the country. And people in those communities need to be going into those offices, and those representatives need to be meeting people in those communities so that they can hear and learn from people most impacted by these issues who have the same analysis that you just laid out. So, those are lived experience. There are lived experiences that should be influencing the policies and the reforms that happen, not just in D.C., but around the country.
Yeah, and I would just add to exactly what Nicole said, that when we worked on lobbying and bringing awareness on the First Step Act in D.C., we were up here all the time, but it was impacted people who actually helped to pass that legislation, because you sent people in those offices that looked like the representatives, and they were able to relate to them. And also, I just started a coalition in New York, New Yorkers United for Justice, where we're looking at criminal justice reform specifically in New York and holding the governor accountable. So we go up to Albany every single week, and we're bringing other impacted people, whether they've been incarcerated, their family members are still incarcerated, or loved ones. So I know, as Nicole said, that we are the voice and we make the change because we know what we need in our communities.
Let me just add that, people cannot underestimate how much social capital they have with their direct representative, with the person whose district they live in, whether or not that's their U.S. congressperson, their U.S. senator, and certainly at the state level, their state rep or assembly person or their state senator. I was just on a phone call a couple weeks ago with 3 mothers whose sons are sentenced to life in prison in Ohio, and they came to me because we launched a campaign at the end of last year to end life imprisonment nationally. And these are mothers who don't have an organizational home in Ohio and are very grassroots, no organizational infrastructure behind them. And when we wrapped up that call, I said, you all may have not had a one-on-one meeting with any elected official, but do not underestimate your power and your social capital as a resident, as a tax-paying community member, and as a voter in whatever district you live in. And you all should be engaging every day, not just when the election time comes around, but the other 364 days of the year with your direct representatives around the policies that you care about. And these women were motivated by the life sentences that their sons are incarcerated with in Ohio.
There was another question. Yes, right here in the front. This woman right here. Glasses, yes.
Oh, thank you. Stacy Bridges, Veterans Vision. I had a couple questions. First question was this: adolescence has become a crime in America, and you joke around at school, you can end up in the principal's office, which you can end up in juvenile, which you would end up into a pipeline into prison. What can we do to decriminalize adolescence? I'm not talking about somebody that's hyped up on antipsychotic drugs out of their mind. I'm talking about kids that are horseplaying, joking around, who may have issues. Why isn't it being dealt with at the school? And my second question is, these private prisons, how will they be regulated? They look like they're not regulated like federal prisons and state prisons are, and now they're more of a place to house people. And I'm wondering what we can do as far as the first step to make sure these private prisons are regulated like the federal and state ones are.
Do you want to take the adolescent question?
I thought you could. I could think.
You all want to choose?
Okay. We were just saying, which one should we take? So, I'll answer the...
Adolescents, because I'm particularly curious about that one.
Which one?
Adolescents, yeah.
So I do think, following up on one of the earlier, your first question, I honestly think that the bipartisan conversation that's playing out not just in DC, but around the country, gives space to change presumptions around interactions with law enforcement, whether or not that's in a school as part of critiquing and moving away from the school to prison pipeline, or whether or not that's in the adult system and can change presumptions around arrest for technical violations and nonviolent offenses, and also revisit even long prison terms for people sentenced to life. So certainly adolescence and what can lead to a law enforcement interaction or a school resource officer interaction in a high school or a middle school should be criticized, should be engaged with, and entire standards should be changed so that the expectation for children, particularly kids at risk of going into the juvenile justice system, should be lessened as much as possible, because kids should be able to age without risk of coming in contact with law enforcement, which can pose a whole range of factors for them, let alone going into a juvenile facility, but just the violence and the negative interactions with the law enforcement officer to begin with can be a troubling thing that can stay with people.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think about why we can't just take it back from when we were younger and we were raised, right? I remember my parents, or my mom, because my father was the sole provider at the time, my mother came to PTA meetings and she was engaged in the school. And I understand that now a lot of times it's single parent homes. And there's, ways that parents can't interact with their children who are in school, and a lot of our parents are incarcerated. So that's another piece of it. But then there's the teachers, there's guidance counselors. There's different ways we're going and calling on the police, even within the communities, even outside the schools, right? And instead of us taking care of each other as a community, we're bringing in law enforcement. So I think the conversation also has to start within the community and within the schools and within the parents and with the teachers to really talk about what we can do to gain control over our youth, right? Because if we don't, then we have to bring them in and we have to do these things. And I don't really think it's necessary. I think like family is the way that we were raised. You know, if we did something, your neighbor took care of it, right? They called your parents. Like, you know, we have to get back to that. I don't think that we have to be so far removed in a society that that doesn't exist.
And
So
then
we
just
got-
to add quickly to the question about private prisons, only 8% of people nationally are incarcerated in private prisons. So that is a question to follow up on. And, you know, before the end of the Obama administration, there's actually efforts to phase out federal private prisons. And in some states, there are a high rate of incarceration in private prisons, like New Mexico. Other states, there are no people incarcerated in private prisons, like Topeka's home state of New York. So it is a question to bring into these conversations, but solving mass incarceration isn't going to happen by looking at private prisons alone. What's going to solve mass incarceration is looking at the number of people going into private and public prisons and looking at ways to divert folks, and also looking at long prison terms as a way to reduce the incarceration rate overall.
So we're out of time, but we did get one question from Twitter from Stacey Bridges. I just want to ask you very quickly, Topeka, about mental health and whether or not how these reforms can help people who are suffering from mental health issues who are caught up in the prison system, from First Step to some of the state reforms.
Right. So with the First Step Act, as it relates to prison reform and things happening within the prison system or federal prison system, that there are new programs being introduced, money going into those programs to help people, opposed to, like when I was in federal prison, basically people just got on pill line and took pills to medicate themselves, and that's how they dealt with mental illness or even depression or anxiety or anything. I also think, you know, when people come home, that it's very important that we go to mental health professionals, that we talk to psychologists. I mean, I go to therapy every single week. I think it's extremely important, not only because of the trauma and things that we face in prison and before prison, but also just the trauma that you have to go through every day in reentry. So, you know, there's the community-based organizations, again, investing money in those that help people who are struggling with mental health issues. And Nicole, if you have anything to add? No?
But I think it's obviously, we have to address mental health as part of this question.
Yes.
We do, and if you haven't seen it, if you go to hill.tv, we did a great interview. Charlemagne the God and I had a conversation about his struggle with anxiety and our conversations about, as Black men who both have gone to therapy, what that's about and the importance of that for communities and really normalizing that. So we talk about mental health. I would just point you to that interview because I think it was a good one, if I say so myself.
No plug.
All right, thank you two for being
Thank
here.
you.